We secured this land by the blood of heroes. Now we must secure our future, a future of liberty and strength.
I shall not expect to perform the arduous duties of the
Let's rewind to February 9, 1773. Virginia plantations stretched like kingdoms across the colonial landscape. Slavery dominated the economy. The British Crown still ruled from 3,000 miles away. And in the middle of this world, being torn apart by revolution, William Henry Harrison was born into one of Virginia's most powerful families. His father, Benjamin Harrison, wasn't just wealthy. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Think about that for a second. His father literally risked his life to say America should be free. That kind of legacy doesn't just disappear. It seeps into your bones. It becomes your expectation. Young William grew up surrounded by political conversation. Not the dinner table kind where everyone nods politely. This was intense, heated discussion about liberty, freedom, and what America should become. His father was friends with Thomas Jefferson. These weren't abstract ideas being discussed, they were personal stakes in the nation's future. The timing of William's birth meant something crucial. He'd never fully remember colonial rule. He'd grow up in a nation fighting to be born. Revolutionary War cannons echoed across Virginia when he was a teenager. He watched ideals transform into reality. This created an unusual psychological imprint. For Harrison, American independence wasn't theoretical. It was his childhood. It was normal. It was destiny. His education reflected his class. Private tutors prepared him for leadership from the beginning. Languages, history, philosophy not because they were required, but because his family assumed he'd need them. They weren't wrong. By age 17, his father enrolled him at the University of Pennsylvania to study medicine. This matters because most future presidents studied law. Harrison chose medicine. He wanted to heal people, not argue about them. But something shifted in 1791. His father died. The inheritance passed to him, but something else did too: responsibility. The next generation had to prove they were worthy of the revolution their fathers had fought. William Henry Harrison couldn't just be a doctor. That felt too small, too insignificant. He needed to do something bigger. Within months, Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone. He left medicine. He joined the United States Army as an ensign in 1791. His wealthy family was stunned. Why would their privileged son choose military life? Why accept a low rank when political office beckoned? The answer reveals something fundamental about Harrison's character. He wasn't interested in shortcuts. He wanted to earn respect through action, not inherit it through family connections. That decision, choosing to start from the bottom, would become the foundation of his entire public image. He was stationed at Fort Washington, deep in the Ohio Territory. The 1790s were chaotic times in the frontier. Native American tribes weren't passive observers of American expansion. They were fighting back. The Miami Confederacy, led by a brilliant strategist named Little Turtle, had devastated American forces in battle. This wasn't a minor skirmish. It was a wake-up call that the frontier wasn't safely controlled by the new nation. Harrison threw himself into this conflict. He learned military strategy, frontier tactics, and something even more important, diplomacy. He studied Native American cultures, learned their languages, and understood their perspectives. This wasn't political correctness. This was practical necessity. You don't survive frontiers by ignoring the people who know them. By 1794, things changed dramatically. General Anthony Wayne, called Mad Anthony by soldiers because of his aggressive tactics, arrived to reorganize the military efforts. Wayne saw something in young Harrison. He promoted him to captain and made him his aide-de-camp. This was recognition. This was validation that the former plantation owner could actually lead. The Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794 became Harrison's trial by fire. This wasn't a theoretical military exercise. This was real combat where hesitation meant death. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it was decisive. Harrison participated in the victory that effectively ended the open warfare on the Ohio frontier. The Miami Confederacy was defeated. The era of major Native American resistance east of the Mississippi was ending. But here's what historians often miss. Harrison didn't celebrate destruction. He participated in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, where American negotiators established formal peace with tribal nations. Harrison recognized that winning battles wasn't the same as winning peace. You could kill enemies, but you had to negotiate with a nation that would remain forever. This experience shaped his entire approach to the frontier. Strength respected strength. But respect also required fair dealing. You couldn't just take land. You had to negotiate for it, make treaties, and maintain relationships. It wasn't noble, it was practical. Dead neighbors cause problems. Living neighbors you've treated fairly become business partners. By the late 1790s, Harrison had become something special. He wasn't just a military officer, he was a frontier expert. He'd fought in battles. He'd negotiated treaties. He'd learned languages, and crucially, he'd survived. The young plantation owner had transformed into a real military commander. Then fate intervened again. In 1798, the federal government needed someone to manage the newly acquired territories beyond the Ohio River. President John Adams didn't randomly select William Henry Harrison. He specifically chose him. Why? Because Harrison had proven he could navigate the impossible space between military force, political negotiation, and frontier reality. Harrison became the governor of the Northwest Territory at age 25. Think about that. The entire region north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio all fell under his authority. He was responsible for organizing a wilderness into a functional government. His first priority, legitimacy. Harrison knew that people respect authority when it's visibly fair. He immediately established courts, created legal codes, and organized the territory into counties. He wasn't ruling like a dictator, he was building institutions. This might sound boring to modern ears, but it was revolutionary at the time. Most frontier governors just exploited their positions. Harrison actually wanted to build something lasting. But his signature move came through land acquisition. This is where Harrison's genius became apparent, and also where his approach became morally complicated. The United States needed settlers to move west. Settlers needed land. The tribes needed to maintain their territories. These three needs were fundamentally incompatible. Harrison did something clever and troubling. He negotiated treaties with individual tribes rather than unified tribal confederacies. This exploited internal tribal divisions. Some tribal leaders wanted to maintain peaceful relations with the United States. Others wanted to preserve traditional lands. By negotiating with receptive leaders, Harrison could claim legitimate treaties while effectively isolating holdouts. Between 1800 and 1809, Harrison negotiated a series of treaties that transferred millions of acres to American control. The Treaty of Greenville, the Fort Wayne Treaty, the Treaty of Vincennes, names that echo through history as moments when Native Americans permanently lost ground. What's crucial to understand, Harrison believed he was civilizing the frontier. He genuinely thought he was helping tribes assimilate into American society by teaching them to farm individual plots rather than maintain communal hunting grounds. He wasn't consciously evil. He was serving American expansion while believing he was actually helping the people being displaced. This cognitive dissonance wasn't unique to Harrison. It was the fundamental contradiction of the age. American progress required territorial expansion. Territorial expansion required displacing the people already there. Most Americans solved this contradiction by not thinking about it too hard. Harrison, to his credit, actually wrestled with it. He lost the wrestling match, but he engaged with the moral problem. His most famous action as territorial governor came in 1811. A Shawnee leader named Tecumseh began something revolutionary. He united tribes across the entire frontier into a unified confederation. This was dangerous to American expansion. Unified tribes could effectively resist American takeover of lands. Harrison recognized the threat immediately. He assembled a militia force and marched directly at Tecumseh's headquarters, a village called Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River. Tecumseh wasn't present when Harrison arrived, but his followers attacked at dawn. The battle was fierce, confused, and ultimately resulted in Harrison's forces burning Prophetstown. The Battle of the Tippecanoe in November 1811 became Harrison's defining military moment. He didn't decisively defeat Tecumseh, but he broke the unified tribal confederation before it could fully mobilize. This made him a national hero overnight. Newspapers celebrated the victory. Americans saw him as the man who'd protected their western expansion. What they didn't see, Tecumseh survived the battle. He'd flee to Canada and eventually ally with the British during the War of 1812. The victory seemed decisive in the moment, but it hadn't actually resolved the underlying conflict. The War of 1812 transformed William Henry Harrison into a national figure. When war was declared against Britain in June 1812, the British immediately leveraged their alliance with tribal nations, particularly Tecumseh's Confederation, to launch attacks on American settlements and military positions in the Great Lakes region. The U.S. Army needed someone who could defend the frontier while also fighting British forces. They needed someone who understood both military tactics and the complicated indigenous alliance structure. They needed William Henry Harrison. He was promoted to Major General and given command of the Army of the Northwest. This wasn't just a formal promotion. This was placing the entire Northern war effort in his hands. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Harrison failed, the British could invade from Canada. If the tribal nations remained unified, American settlements could be overrun. Harrison's first major engagement came at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. British forces and their Native American allies were retreating through Canada after being defeated elsewhere. Harrison pursued them with a force of nearly 4,000 men. The climactic battle happened in southern Ontario. The American victory was complete and decisive. More importantly, Tecumseh died in the battle. The great unifier of tribal nations fell, and with him fell the most serious Native American challenge to American expansion. The tribal confederation fractured. Without Tecumseh's visionary leadership, individual tribes made separate peace arrangements. For Americans in 1813, Harrison became the warrior who defeated the British and destroyed the threat of unified tribal resistance. He was the man who'd made Western expansion safe. The press celebrated him. Politicians courted him. By the time the War of 1812 ended in December 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent, which basically returned everything to pre-war status, Harrison had already become something more than a general. He'd become a symbol. This is crucial. Symbols are more powerful than military victories. Wars end. Peace treaties fade into history, but symbols persist. Harrison had become the symbol of American frontier dominance. After the war ended, Harrison did something that surprised people. He retired from the military. He could have leveraged his fame into a generalship or high political office. Instead, he moved to Ohio and became a gentleman farmer. He married his longtime love, Anna Sims, and began raising a family. This retirement was strategic, though it didn't appear that way. By stepping back from military life, Harrison allowed mythology to grow around his accomplishments. He wasn't diminishing his achievements through scandal or controversy. He was letting his reputation crystallize into legend. He served briefly in Congress between 1816 and 1819, representing Ohio. These years were relatively quiet. No major legislation bears his name. No famous speeches changed history. But he was building relationships, making allies, and earning respect through steady competence. The 1820s were transformative years in American politics. The old party system was collapsing. The Democratic Republicans, once a unified party, were fracturing into competing factions. Regional interests north, south, west were pulling in different directions. The political landscape was chaotic, and into this chaos stepped ambitious men seeking to exploit the confusion. Harrison's name began appearing in political conversations. He wasn't actively campaigning, that would have been unseemly. But powerful men were whispering his name as a potential presidential candidate. Here's where the story gets interesting. Political handlers and party operatives recognized something crucial. Harrison was popular without being controversial. He was famous for military victories, which nearly all Americans supported. He was from Ohio, an important state with growing population and influence. He didn't have a long record of political votes that could be criticized. He was relatively unknown at the national level, which meant voters could project their own hopes onto him. In 1836, Harrison was nominated as the Whig Party's presidential candidate. The Whigs were the opposition party to Andrew Jackson's Democrats. They needed someone who could challenge Jackson's popular appeal. Harrison seemed perfect. A military hero, Western credential, no controversial political record. The campaign was unlike anything American politics had seen before. It was the first modern political campaign, using mass media, popular symbolism, and emotional appeals rather than just policy discussion. The Whigs transformed Harrison into a specific image, a simple frontier man. They created the log cabin and hard cider campaign. They gave out hard cider at rallies. They emphasized his military past and frontier background. They literally dressed supporters in coonskin caps to evoke frontier imagery. What's remarkable is how calculated this was. Harrison actually came from a wealthy plantation family. He'd been educated at an elite university. His family was connected to the founding generation. But the Whigs deliberately obscured this. They made him seem like a self-made frontier hero who'd risen from nothing. The irony is that voters didn't care about actual facts. They cared about the story. They wanted to believe in the log cabin hero. The Whigs gave them that story, and voters rewarded them with enthusiasm. Harrison ran against the incumbent, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was actually a more accomplished politician. But he'd inherited the presidency from Jackson and seemed like a continuation of someone else's rule. Harrison was new, fresh, and exciting. The Whig campaign brilliantly framed the election as a choice between fresh energy and tired continuation. Harrison won decisively. He received 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. It was a massive mandate. Americans wanted something new, and Harrison represented that. But here's where the story takes a dark turn, because Harrison had made explicit promises to powerful Whig politicians. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and other senior Whigs believed they'd nominated Harrison as a figurehead president. They thought they could control him. They thought he'd defer to their judgment on major policy decisions. Harrison had other ideas. On March 4, 1841, William Henry Harrison stood at the Capitol to take the presidential oath. He was 68 years old, the oldest person to assume the presidency up to that time. The crowds were enormous. Americans wanted to see their new leader. The inauguration ceremony happened on a cold, wet day. Harrison decided to give the longest inaugural address in American history. At approximately 8,445 words, it took nearly 2 hours to deliver. He wore no coat, no hat, just his formal clothes. Journalists noted how dignified and robust he appeared. In the speech, Harrison laid out his vision. He would be a president who respected the Constitution and limited presidential power. He wouldn't overstep his authority. He'd defer to Congress. He'd be a proper Republican president, servant of the people's representatives, not a dictatorial executive. The irony is that this message was music to the Whigs' ears. They thought he was essentially promising to be manageable, to be their president. But immediately after assuming office, Harrison made a shocking announcement. He would not be controlled by party operatives. He would not simply accept Henry Clay's recommendations for his cabinet. He would make his own decisions. This was politically explosive. The Whigs had nominated what they thought was a docile figurehead, and instead, they'd elected a man with his own agenda. Harrison spent his first weeks making cabinet appointments that represented his vision, not the party leadership's vision. He appointed John Tyler as vice president now. Tyler was a secondary figure, but his presence was symbolic. Harrison was making it clear that he was the president. He was the one making decisions. The Whig elite didn't get to run the government. Harrison also demonstrated sympathy for Native American rights. Despite his military victories, Harrison had evolved in his thinking. He suggested that tribal nations deserved some legal protection and that American expansion shouldn't completely erase indigenous peoples from the map. This was controversial. Many American settlers wanted complete Native American removal. Harrison seemed to be suggesting a more complicated approach. For the first time in his life, Harrison had real power, and he was using it in ways that seemed to contradict what people expected from him. Historians ask a crucial question. What would have happened if Harrison had lived? Would his administration have challenged the Whigs' dominance? Would he have carved out a presidency of genuine independence? Would he have reshaped American politics? We'll never know. March was Harrison's month of triumph. April became his nightmare. The first indicators of illness appeared in late March. Harrison reported feeling cold and fatigued. Given the wet, cold conditions of his outdoor inaugural ceremony, this wasn't unusual. Many people developed illnesses that spring. The 19th century had no modern medicine. Common colds could persist for weeks. But Harrison's condition deteriorated rapidly. By April 1st, he was running a high fever. His physician, Dr. William Worthington, recommended rest and traditional remedies. In the 1840s, medical treatment was limited. Doctors primarily used bloodletting, literally draining blood from patients, based on the theory that illness resulted from an excess of blood. They also used calomel, a mercury compound used as a laxative, and quinine. None of these treatments would help someone with an actual infection. The consensus among doctors is that Harrison contracted either pneumonia or influenza, possibly both. His symptoms included fever, severe cough, and respiratory distress. This was dangerous before antibiotics existed. Without modern medicine, respiratory infections were commonly fatal. Harrison tried to continue his presidential duties, despite being seriously ill. He had conversations with cabinet members while running a fever. He met with politicians to discuss legislative priorities. He refused to publicly admit how sick he actually was. This was partly presidential pride. He didn't want to appear weak. It was also partly practical necessity. Showing weakness might encourage those who wanted to challenge his authority. But the illness was relentless. By mid-April, Harrison was confined to bed. His fever refused to break. His cough worsened. He was clearly dying, and everyone around him knew it. His wife, Anna Sims Harrison, was devastated. She'd been married to this man for nearly 30 years. She'd supported him through military campaigns, territorial governance, and political campaigns. Now she watched him slip away. The cabinet members gathered in anxious clusters. They discussed the constitutional implications. If Harrison died, Tyler would become president. But nobody expected this. Nobody had anticipated that the president would die in office. The newspapers reported his illness, but with optimistic language. "The president is recuperating" became the constant refrain. Americans held on to hope that their new leader would recover. He wouldn't. April 1841 turned into a deathbed vigil. Harrison's condition deteriorated day by day. His breathing became labored. His fever remained elevated. His mental state fluctuated between lucidity and delirium. On April 3rd, Sunday, Harrison's condition seemed to worsen significantly. The attending physicians believed the end was approaching. His family gathered in his bedroom. Cabinet members waited anxiously in outer chambers. At 4:30 p.m. on April 4, 1841, William Henry Harrison died. The man who'd been inaugurated exactly 31 days earlier was gone. After 68 years of life military service, territorial governance, war, political campaigns, it ended in his bed, killed by a simple respiratory infection. The immediate reaction was shock and disbelief. The president was dead. Not from assassination, not from combat, from illness, from a condition that modern medicine would treat with antibiotics. The nation fell into mourning. Americans who'd cheered for him at rallies now mourned his passing. Newspapers printed black borders. Memorial services were held in cities across the country. There was a genuine sense of tragedy and loss. But underneath the mourning was something more complex. Political calculation. John Tyler now became president. Tyler was a Southerner, more aligned with states' rights and the South's political interests. The Whigs who'd nominated Harrison suddenly faced the uncomfortable reality that they'd positioned a Southern conservative to become president if Harrison died. Historical conspiracy theories immediately emerged. Some whispered that political enemies had poisoned Harrison. Others suggested the Whigs had deliberately exposed him to illness. Neither theory was true, but the very fact that people invented them shows how shocking his death was. Harrison's death created something unexpected, a constitutional vacuum. The Constitution stated that if a president died, the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency. But ambiguous language created a major question. Did Tyler become acting president, or did he become president? Tyler made a decisive choice. He wouldn't act as a caretaker. He declared himself president. He took the oath of office. He moved into the White House. He began making executive decisions as a full president, not as a temporary substitute. The Whigs were furious. They'd effectively lost control of the government. They'd maneuvered Harrison into the presidency, only to have him die and be replaced by someone they couldn't control. But Tyler's decision to become president rather than acting president had enormous constitutional implications. It established a precedent that was formalized decades later. When a president dies, the vice president becomes president with full powers, not a temporary successor. This precedent shaped American history. 9 vice presidents would assume the presidency due to presidential death or assassination. Harrison's death, completely accidental, essentially wrote part of the Constitution through precedent. The Whigs tried to remove Tyler from power through various political maneuvers. They attempted impeachment. They tried to pass bills that would limit his authority. Nothing worked. Tyler was president, and he used his power to pursue his own political agenda, including the annexation of Texas and other policies the Whigs opposed. Harrison's death had consequences that rippled through decades of American history. First, it emboldened Southern interests within American politics. Tyler's ascension to power meant a Southern president was making decisions about territorial expansion and slavery policy. Where Harrison might have pursued more anti-slavery positions, Tyler actively championed slavery expansion. Second, it fragmented the Whig Party. The party that had won the election so decisively fell apart almost immediately. Without Harrison, the party lacked a unifying figure. Henry Clay's ambitions to run the government through a controllable president were thwarted. The party never truly recovered. It eventually collapsed by the 1850s, replaced by the Republican Party. Third, it shaped the 1844 election. Tyler, despite being president, wasn't nominated by either major party for re-election. He was politically toxic. James K. Polk, a Democrat, won that election. Polk pursued aggressive territorial expansion, including the Mexican-American War. This war itself became a flashpoint in the slavery debate, as it acquired vast territories where slavery expansion became a central political question. The path from Harrison's death to the Civil War is traceable through political consequences. The Whig Party's destruction left the anti-slavery movement without an effective political vehicle. The party that emerged to replace the Whigs, the Republican Party, wouldn't form until 1854. That gap in political representation meant slavery expansion went relatively unchallenged between 1844 and the mid-1850s. Fourth, Harrison's death redefined what Americans expected from the presidency. The country had elected a man expecting longevity, competence, and sustained leadership. They got 31 days. Americans began to carefully consider presidential health and succession. They understood viscerally that the president wasn't invulnerable. This consciousness influenced subsequent elections. It made vice presidential selection more important. It made the public more attuned to candidates' health and age. It fundamentally changed how Americans assessed presidential fitness. Fifth, it exposed the precariousness of 19th-century medical science. Harrison died from what modern antibiotics would cure in days. His death demonstrated that no amount of wealth or prestige could protect against common illness. The richest man in America, which, the president essentially could be killed by a common infection. This realization pushed American society toward investing in medical advancement. The institutions and resources that would eventually produce germ theory and antibiotics were partially motivated by the horror that even presidents could die from preventable infections. What should we make of William Henry Harrison's legacy? The question is more complicated than it initially seems. On one level, he was a man who seized every opportunity available to him. He transformed himself from a wealthy plantation heir into a military officer, territorial governor, and president. He didn't inherit these positions, he achieved them through demonstrated competence and careful political maneuvering. On another level, he was complicit in the displacement and destruction of Native American nations. The treaties he negotiated systematically transferred tribal lands to American control. His military victories, however justified in the context of warfare, effectively ended the possibility of independent Native American political entities east of the Mississippi River. The moral contradiction of his life is that both things are simultaneously true. He was an achiever and a displeaser. He was ambitious and principled. He was innovative politically and destructive to indigenous peoples. Modern historians are increasingly skeptical of portraying him as a simple frontier hero. They recognize that heroism in one narrative becomes catastrophe in another. To American settlers, Harrison was a hero who made the frontier safe. To Native American peoples, Harrison was a catalyst for dispossession and destruction. This complexity doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. It's part of how we understand American history. The nation was built on territorial expansion, and that expansion was achieved through the displacement of existing populations. Harrison was an effective agent of that expansion. What's perhaps most interesting about Harrison is how he was used after his death. The Whigs immortalized him as a symbol. Subsequent politicians invoked his memory to justify various political positions. He became less a real historical figure and more a political resource, a name and image that could be deployed for different purposes. His presidency lasted 31 days, yet his death sparked constitutional changes, fragmented a political party, and demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful figures to circumstance. One of the enduring historical mysteries is, what would have happened if Harrison had lived? Would he have become a transformative president? Would he have challenged the Whig establishment more forcefully? Would his presidency have reshaped American politics? These questions are unanswerable, but they're worth contemplating because they illuminate what was possible. Consider the possibilities. Harrison had demonstrated strong-willed independence immediately upon taking office. He wasn't following Henry Clay's directives, he was making his own decisions. Had he lived, he might have established a presidency that was genuinely independent of party leadership. This would have reshaped how the executive branch understood its relationship to Congress and party structures. Consider also that Harrison had shown some sympathy for Native American rights, a more complicated position than the aggressive expansionism favored by many Americans. Had he lived, his administration might have pursued a more nuanced Indian policy that preserved more tribal autonomy. Even within the context of American expansion, consider finally that Harrison had shown genuine respect for constitutional limits on presidential power. Unlike some later presidents, he believed in the constitutional separation of powers. Had he lived, he might have established precedents for executive restraint that would have influenced presidential behavior for decades. But these are all speculations. They're exercises in historical imagination, not historical fact. What we know is what actually happened. He died, Tyler became president, the Whigs fell apart, and American history took a particular trajectory. The value of contemplating counterfactuals isn't to rewrite history. It's to understand what was contingent about the actual history that unfolded. We might have had a different America if Harrison had lived. The fact that we didn't reminds us that history is fragile, contingent, and dependent on circumstances beyond anyone's control. For over 150 years, nobody knew exactly what killed Harrison. Pneumonia was the general diagnosis, but historians and medical researchers wanted more precision. Was it bacterial pneumonia? Influenza? Typhoid fever? Something else? In 2014, a medical researcher named Zachary Lyons began investigating Harrison's death using historical records. He carefully read letters, medical accounts, and contemporary descriptions of symptoms. Lyons noticed something interesting. The medical descriptions of Harrison's illness didn't perfectly match pneumonia. The symptoms suggested something else: typhoid fever. Typhoid is spread through contaminated water. If the White House water supply was contaminated, it could have infected Harrison despite his wealth and access to the best medical care available. The White House, at that time, was situated between the Potomac River and the sewage system. Contamination of the water supply wasn't just possible, it was likely many people in Washington got sick during early spring due to contaminated water as weather warmed and sewage systems became unstable. If Lyons is correct, Harrison died not from pneumonia but from typhoid fever, a disease spread through poor sanitation, not through the elaborate conspiracy theories that had circulated for over a century. The irony is exquisite. The most powerful man in America was killed by the same sanitation problems that killed ordinary people. His wealth and position couldn't protect him from a contaminated water supply. His power was irrelevant when confronted with something so basic and primitive. This medical conclusion transforms how we understand Harrison's death. It wasn't the inevitable result of age or inherent weakness. It was the result of public health failure. It was preventable. It was a tragedy that stemmed from 19th century Americans' insufficient understanding of disease transmission. How do historians measure a president's impact? Usually, they look at accomplishments, legislative achievements, or transformations of policy. By those metrics, Harrison accomplished almost nothing. He was president for 31 days. He had no time to sign major legislation or reshape policy. Yet by other metrics' influence on historical trajectory, constitutional precedent, political consequences, Harrison's impact is enormous. His death fundamentally altered American political history. This raises philosophical questions about what we mean by impact. Does impact require intentional accomplishment? Or can impact result from circumstances beyond anyone's control? If Harrison's death fragmented the Whig Party and influenced territorial policy, did he accomplish that? Or was it something that happened to him, not something he accomplished? Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of Harrison's story. Impact and intention aren't always aligned. We often achieve our greatest influence through circumstances we neither planned nor controlled. Harrison's presidency was cut short by disease, but that cutting short became his most significant political act. His death accomplished more than his governance ever could have. This is both comforting and unsettling. It's comforting because it suggests that even brief lives can have enormous consequences. It's unsettling because it means our most important impacts might be entirely outside our control. William Henry Harrison came from privilege. He inherited wealth, social position, and powerful family connections. But he didn't rest on those inheritances. He built his own reputation through military service, political achievement, and careful self-presentation. He transformed himself from a wealthy plantation heir into a frontier hero, a war general, a territorial governor, and finally a president. At every stage, he demonstrated competence, intelligence, and political skill. He wasn't just riding on family connections. He was actually accomplishing things, making real decisions that shaped history. His life teaches us about ambition, about the willingness to take risks, and about the strange ways history unfolds. He was elected president on a wave of popular enthusiasm. He took office planning to reshape the executive branch. And then, 31 days later, he was dead. His death was meaningless. In one sense, it resulted from contaminated water and 19th century medicine, not from any grand historical force. Yet that meaningless death had profound consequences. It toppled the political party that elected him. It established constitutional precedents about presidential succession. It influenced the trajectory of American expansion and slavery politics. This is the paradox of history. The most important events often stem from the most arbitrary causes. Harrison caught a cold that turned into typhoid fever. That disease killed him. That death fragmented a political party. That fragmentation reshaped American politics for decades. His story reminds us that we're all fragile. The most powerful among us can be killed by circumstances beyond our control. And when we die, the consequences ripple forward in ways we never anticipated. Harrison didn't change America through his governance. He changed it through his death. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at what the 1840 election and Harrison's presidency reveal about how American democracy actually functioned, not as textbooks describe it, but as it really worked. The Whigs didn't nominate Harrison because he was the most qualified candidate. They nominated him because he was politically useful. His military reputation made him electable. His relative lack of political record meant he had no controversial votes to criticize. His frontier background appealed to expanding Western voters. He was, in other words, perfectly designed by political operatives to win an election. This is the birth of modern political marketing. Before Harrison, presidential campaigns were often about policy positions, party ideology, and elite endorsements. The 1840 campaign pioneered techniques we'd recognize today: candidate branding, emotional appeals, symbol manipulation, and mass marketing. The log cabin and hard cider campaign created a persona for Harrison that was largely fictional. Yes, he'd lived on the frontier, but he came from wealth. He'd been educated at an elite university. His family was connected to America's founding. Yet the campaign emphasized his humble background and frontier toughness because that's what voters responded to emotionally. This revealed something profound about American democracy. Voters respond to narratives more than facts. They want stories they can believe in. They want symbols they can connect with. The Whigs gave them that, and it worked spectacularly. What's disturbing is that this same dynamic continues today. Political campaigns use the same basic techniques: create a compelling narrative, connect it to voter emotions, and repeat it relentlessly. Policies become secondary to story. Facts become less important than narrative. Harrison's campaign showed that American voters were susceptible to sophisticated political manipulation. This isn't a criticism of 1840 voters. Specifically, modern voters face the same pressures, often with more sophisticated technology behind them. But the fundamental dynamic was established. Elections are won through narrative control, not necessarily through policy superiority. When John Tyler became president after Harrison's death, few people understood how profoundly this would reshape American politics. Tyler was a states' rights conservative who believed in limited federal power. The Whigs who'd nominated him assumed he'd be a figurehead, controlled by Henry Clay and other party leaders. Instead, Tyler used his unexpected presidency to pursue an aggressively pro-Southern, pro-states' rights agenda. Within 2 years, Tyler had alienated virtually every Whig in Congress. He pursued the annexation of Texas, a move that would dramatically expand slavery territory. He negotiated the Tyler Doctrine, which asserted American hemispheric supremacy. He made appointments that ignored Whig preferences. The Whigs attempted to impeach Tyler. They tried to pass bills limiting his authority. They introduced resolutions of censure. Nothing worked. Tyler held the presidency, and he used it. What would have happened if Harrison had lived? Almost certainly, Tyler would have remained a minor political figure. The presidency would have remained in Whig hands. The trajectory of territorial expansion might have been different. The slavery question might have developed differently. The road to the Civil War might have looked completely different. Consider this: Harrison's death directly enabled the annexation of Texas under Tyler. The annexation of Texas was a crucial step toward the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War created the territorial question that nearly destroyed the Republic in the 1850s. That territorial question ultimately contributed to the conditions that made the Civil War inevitable. Trace the chain backward. Civil War origins gives 1850s territorial disputes, gives Mexican-American War, gives Texas annexation, gives Tyler presidency, gives Harrison's death. A disease that wouldn't be fatal with modern medicine killed a president. And that death's consequences echoed through American history for the next 20 years, culminating in the Civil War. We've discussed Harrison's relationship with Native Americans at various points. but it deserves deeper examination because it reveals the genuine complexity of American expansion and the cost paid by indigenous peoples. Harrison wasn't uniquely evil in his approach to Native American policy. He was actually more thoughtful and sophisticated than many of his contemporaries. He studied tribal cultures. He learned indigenous languages. He attempted to understand indigenous perspectives, and yet precisely because he was thoughtful and sophisticated, his actions were perhaps more effective at destroying Native American independence than crude force might have been. The treaties Harrison negotiated were technically legal agreements between sovereign entities, but they exploited divisions within tribal nations. They used economic incentives to encourage certain tribal leaders to agree to land cessions. They represented the soft power of American expansion, not brutal conquest, but sophisticated negotiation that achieved expansionist goals while maintaining the appearance of fair dealing. From a Native American perspective, Harrison's sophistication made him more dangerous, not less. A brutally aggressive American official might have united tribes against him. Harrison's willingness to negotiate made some tribal leaders believe they could achieve acceptable terms through agreement. This undermined the possibility of unified Native American resistance. The cumulative effect of Harrison's treaties was devastating to tribal nations. Millions of acres passed from Native American control to American settlement. Hunting grounds disappeared. Traditional ways of life became impossible. Forced relocations separated tribes from ancestral territories. And yet here's the uncomfortable truth: this expansion created the modern United States. The nation Harrison helped expand became the industrial power that would lead the world. The settlers who took tribal lands became Americans. Their descendants built cities, universities, and institutions that shaped world history. This doesn't justify the displacement of Native Americans. It explains why it happened. Americans wanted land. Indians occupied it. Americans had superior military technology and organizational capacity. The Indians were displaced. This is what happened across North America, and Harrison was an effective agent of this process. The moral accounting is difficult. Should we judge Harrison by the standards of his time when expansion was considered inevitable and proper? Or should we judge him by contemporary moral standards which recognize that indigenous peoples had rights and that their displacement was unjust? Both approaches have merit. Both approaches produce uncomfortable conclusions. The Whig Party was born in the 1830s as a coalition opposing Andrew Jackson's Democratic dominance. It successfully nominated and elected Harrison in 1840. Then it promptly fell apart. The immediate cause was Tyler's assumption of the presidency and his betrayal of Whig interests. But the deeper cause was that the Whig coalition had never been truly unified. The party included Northern industrialists, Southern slaveholders, Western expansionists, and various other groups that had little in common except opposition to Jackson and the Democrats. Without a unifying enemy, Jackson was out of office and without effective leadership after Harrison's death. The coalition fractured. Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs increasingly disagreed about slavery expansion. Eastern Whigs and Western Whigs disagreed about territorial policy. The party limped through the 1840s and 1850s, becoming increasingly irrelevant. By 1854, the Whig Party was effectively dead. It was replaced by the Republican Party, which formed specifically around opposition to slavery expansion. The Republicans united the anti-slavery movement Northern Whigs, Free Soil Democrats, and various other groups who believed slavery should not expand into new territories. This transformation wouldn't have happened exactly this way if Harrison had lived. A successful Whig presidency under Harrison might have strengthened the party. A stronger Whig party might have captured the anti-slavery movement instead of the replicants. The Republican Party might never have formed in its actual historical configuration. The reality is that the party that would produce Abraham Lincoln, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, the party that fought the Civil War and ended slavery, might not have existed in its actual form if Harrison hadn't died. Or it might have existed, but with different leadership and perhaps different priorities. This is not to say the Republicans wouldn't have emerged or wouldn't have fought slavery. But the specific party that emerged, with its specific leadership, its specific policies, and its specific cultural identity, was shaped by Harrison's death and its political consequences. Immediately after Harrison's death, newspapers began constructing a narrative about what his death meant. They portrayed him as a martyr to his duty. He'd given his life to serve the nation. He'd worked so hard in those 31 days that it had exhausted him. He was a tragic hero cut down in his prime by circumstance beyond his control. This narrative was partly true and partly constructed. Yes, he died while serving as president. But he died from contaminated water and 19th century medicine, not from overwork. The narrative of the self-sacrificing president was more compelling than the reality of poor sanitation. However, this media construction of Harrison's meaning reveals something important about how historical narratives form. The public doesn't just learn facts about the past, they learn stories about the past. Those stories are shaped by media narratives, political uses, and cultural needs. Different groups used Harrison's death differently. The Whigs portrayed him as a tragic loss for their party. Southern Democrats portrayed his death as an intervention of Providence that prevented anti-slavery policies. Western expansionists portrayed his death as tragic because he'd supported their expansion agenda. Different audiences read different meanings into the same event. This multiplicative interpretation is a feature of historical events, not a bug. The same event can be understood differently depending on one's perspective and values. Harrison's death was a national tragedy. It was also a political opportunity. It was a turning point in American history. It was also a minor medical event in the context of the thousands of people dying from disease that year. The fact that it was all of these things simultaneously reveals the complexity of how we understand history. We don't experience history as a set of objective facts. We experience it through narratives. And those narratives are shaped by our position in society, our political commitments, and our cultural frameworks. Harrison wasn't the last president to die in office. 4 other presidents would die during their presidencies. Zachary Taylor, in 1850, Warren G. Harding, in 1923, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1945, and John F. Kennedy, in 1963. Additionally, 4 presidents were assassinated, which is a different category. Comparing Harrison's death to these later presidential deaths reveals interesting patterns. Zachary Taylor, another Whig president, died from what historians believe was cholera or acute gastroenteritis. Taylor had been president for only 16 months longer than Harrison, but still a relatively brief presidency. Like Harrison, his death was unexpected and shocking. Warren G. Harding died from a heart attack after 2 years and 4 months as president. By this point, medical science had advanced substantially, but sudden cardiac deaths were still largely unpredictable and unpreventable. Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office after more than 3 years as president, while serving his 4th term. By this time, medical science had advanced further, but Roosevelt's death from a cerebral hemorrhage was still sudden and unpredictable. What's interesting is that Harrison's death happened in an era before modern medicine, before presidential health screening, and before people commonly understood disease transmission. Later presidential deaths happened in eras with increasingly sophisticated medicine, yet presidents still died. This suggests that presidential mortality, while reduced by modern medicine, remains an inherent feature of democratic systems. The difference is that we now screen presidential candidates for health conditions and expect transparency about presidential medical records. We have Secret Service protection against assassination. We have immediate emergency medical response. But we still can't completely eliminate the possibility of presidential death or incapacity. Harrison's death came before these safeguards existed. It was shocking precisely because people weren't accustomed to thinking about presidential succession. His death forced American democracy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Presidents are human, and humans are mortal. Harrison's presidency, though brief, occurred at a crucial moment in American economic and territorial development. The 1840s were years of rapid westward expansion and economic transformation. The Indian Removal Act, signed by Andrew Jackson in 1830, had set in motion the forced relocation of tribes from eastern territories to Oklahoma and territories west of the Mississippi. Harrison's treaties and military victories had accelerated this process, making large tracts of land available for American settlement. Settlers poured into these newly available lands. Ohio, which had been frontier when Harrison was territorial governor, was now becoming a developed state. Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan were rapidly filling with American settlers. The Western territories were being incorporated into the American economic system. This expansion created economic opportunities and economic conflicts. Northern industrialists wanted tariff protection. Southern plantation owners opposed tariffs that would increase their costs. Western settlers wanted government infrastructure investment. Eastern businessmen wanted fiscal conservatism. The Tyler administration, which Harrison's death enabled, pursued policies that increasingly favored Southern and Western interests over Northern industrial interests. Had Harrison lived, he might have pursued different economic policies. His cabinet included more Northern industrial interests. His administration might have been more friendly to protective tariffs and federal infrastructure investment. The economic trajectory of the 1840s might have been significantly different. This isn't to say Harrison would have prevented sectional conflict. The underlying tensions between North, South, and West were real and fundamental. But presidential policy choices shape how those tensions develop and escalate. Different policy choices in the 1840s might have created different conditions for the sectional crisis of the 1850s. Today, William Henry Harrison is not remembered by most Americans. He's a historical footnote. Ask someone on the street who he was, and most won't know. Ask them how long he was president, and they'll be stumped. His name exists in history textbooks, but his actual significance has faded into obscurity. Yet the consequences of his death remain embedded in American history. The political configuration that emerged from his presidency, the constitutional precedent established by his succession, the territories that were opened to settlement through his earlier actions, these things are still with us. The America we live in today was shaped, in part, by a man who was president for 31 days and then died from contaminated water. History is filled with these echoes. Events that seemed monumental at the time fade into obscurity. Events that seemed insignificant become world-changing. People who thought they were important aren't remembered. People who died unexpectedly transformed history. William Henry Harrison experienced both extremes. He spent his entire life trying to be important and significant. He died, and that death became his most significant act. His story is a reminder that we live in a world of contingency and consequence, where random events shape the world, where the greatest impacts often come from unexpected sources, and where history is stranger and more complex than any of our carefully constructed narratives. William Henry Harrison is gone. His presidency is over. But the ripples from his death continue forward through time, shaping the world we live in today. And that, ultimately, is his legacy. Not what he accomplished in 31 days, but what his death set in motion that continues to echo through American history, through our politics, through our institutions, and through the complex, fragile world we've inherited from him.